Okay, well, just as I was researching and praying through scripture this week, it just reminded me of how, I think we can come before God and we can expect things from him, but what happens when what we're hoping from him doesn't just quite seem to be the way things work out, right? So while we were in Boston, I had some health issues. And really, this particular thing has been a struggle for me most of my life, but it really came to a head in Boston. I think it was like a lot of stress in my life that kind of took whatever was going on physically and amped it up. But, once I heard there was a chance that I might have ovarian cancer, it rocked my world. Like, they were doing all this, research. I was doing a lot of different tests. But in that moment, when you hear a scary word like cancer, right? Like, it really starts to make you think, like, what do I believe about God? What do I believe is true about this God that I have claimed all my life to believe in and love and serve? But what does it mean when maybe there is something major that's going to happen in my life that's going to make me wonder, where's God in this, right? And so for me, like, I think it's easy sometimes too when you think of all the things you've done for God, and you're like, well, God, I did this for you, I did that for you. Why are you allowing this to happen to me, right? And so I think everybody, regardless of the perspective they're looking at it from, when there's health issues or financial issues, like things that, again, we feel are really outside of our control, it makes us challenge what we believe about God. Why would God allow us to go through these things? And what would be the outcome? Spoiler alert, it actually ended up that I didn't have cancer. There was some stuff going on that we needed to work on, but thankfully it wasn't as far as it could have been. But, for, the couple of weeks when I was waiting for these results, the question was, well, what will I do if, right? The what ifs that we experience in life. What if it is cancer? What if I'm not healed from it? What if? And so I think these are times where our faith will be tested, right? It kind of roots out all of the like kind of surface level stuff that we acknowledge and believe about God, and really gets to the root of, again, what do we believe? And when we go through hard things, it's really easy to wonder where God is in it. So, just to ponder or actually, share if you feel led to, have you ever gone through something and wondered if God was with you? In a doubtful way. I think, of course, we can cling to our faith and feel like, okay, everything's good, God is with me, but has it ever swung the other way where you wondered, is God really in this with me? Am I the only one? No, okay, that's good. Is there anything specific you feel led to share? All good. All right. So we'll dig into scripture here. So just to give you a little bit of context, because we haven't been in the book of Genesis for a little while, what we're seeing here is the story about Jacob, kind of coming from his experience with his brother Esau, right? So earlier in Genesis, Jacob steals Esau's birthright. Although we say steal, Esau gave it to him. So I don't know how much he stole it. But from Jacob's perspective, I think even maybe from the perspective of the writer of Genesis, that there was a deception there, right? There was a bit of a plan that Jacob had to get Esau's birthright and blessing. But because of this, Jacob ran away, right? He's now scared of his brother Esau. When you see the characteristics and how they complement one another, Esau was the big burly outdoorsman, right? And Jacob was the indoors guy that, was not as hairy and bold. And so he would have been physically smaller than Esau. So he's like, I made a mistake with my brother. He has the physical strength to really hurt me. So he runs away, right? He goes to Haran. And along that way, he falls in love with Rachel. And what we see in this story is that Jacob's actually deceived by his father-in-law, because when he thinks he's marrying Rachel, he actually marries Leah. And we're kind of like, oh, how did that happen? How do you not realize, you're with the wrong person? But anyway, so in doing so, he marries Leah. Then he says, well, I still want Rachel, right? And so his father-in-law says, okay, I'll give you Rachel, but you need to work 7 more years for me. Well, those 7 years are up, and Jacob's like, hey, are you going to let us go? And he's like, I don't know when I'm going to let you go, right? So then Jacob gets his wives, and they leave Haran. And they're going back to Canaan. And he hears that Esau is coming, right, to meet him from Edom to meet Jacob. And so Jacob's freaking out, right? Because he ran away from Esau once, and now he's going to have to encounter him, right? So I could probably stop right there with that and just say you can't run away from your fears, right? But what we see is a different story here in Genesis 32. So 32:22-23 says, during the night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 slave women, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream along with all of his possessions. So we see that Jacob has intentionally divided up his family, right, and his possessions because he's fearful of Esau and not sure what will happen. So he's kind of like making contingency plans, right? So we don't see all of his thought process, but he's thinking, okay, well, if I meet Esau here, then he'll potentially impact this group, but then that keeps this group over here safe. So he's kind of has like this 10-step plan for how he's going to get away from Esau and with the least amount of collateral damage as possible, right? So he's 100% sure something bad's going to happen, but he's trying to manipulate the situation to see if he can reduce the collateral damage, right? Because he's fearful of Esau and not sure what will happen. And what we see is that, we could give him the benefit of the doubt, and we could say, okay, well, the way that Jacob is working this out, he's trying to protect his family, right? He got his wives and some slaves and his children, and he's sending them across the way. But what we really see is he's actually made his family more vulnerable, right? And so when we look at Jacob's story up until this point, he doesn't make great decisions, right? And if you even go back to Abraham and Isaac, that would be his father and grandfather, they didn't always make the right choices either, right? But they see God come into their story and kind of take what they're offering God, and he works it out for them. But again, it could look like he's trying to protect his family, but in a way, he's made them more vulnerable. But not only has he made them more vulnerable, he's made himself more vulnerable, right? So to be out in the desert in the middle of the night by yourself was not a good decision, right? So we see Jacob's not the best decision maker so far. And so he's put himself in a very vulnerable place. But the thing is, it's not so much about what he's doing in the present that makes him fearful. What he's actually fearful about is his past sins, right? Things that he's done in the past that he didn't stick around and figure out because he ran away. So he's fearful about what Esau might do to him because of his mistakes in his past. And his fear leads to schemes to protect himself and his family. Like, he's not talking to God about this, right? He's not saying, hey, God, I messed up a long time ago. My brother's mad at me. I'm worried he's going to hurt me. Like, what do I do? No, he doesn't consult God, right? He just tries to figure out the best plan from his perspective on how to, again, have the least collateral damage as possible as he is running away from one situation and running towards another one, right? Like, he's in between a rock and a hard place. He can't turn and go back because he knows his father-in-law is waiting. So he knows the only way is forward, but even forward isn't looking so good for him right now, right? And the thing is, what we see is that, well, one, our sin isn't just, the consequences of our sin doesn't just happen in the moment, right? Sometimes when we sin, we don't see the consequence of it. Sometimes it takes 10, 20 years, right? But the other part of it is that our sin doesn't only impact us. Even if in the moment I didn't directly hurt somebody with my sin, what about 10 years later when I have family and other things going on in my life or new relationships, and because I didn't deal with my sin 20 years ago, it's impacting me in the present, right? So we see this about Jacob. He is kind of delusional in a way and not ready or willing to confront, right? The ways that he has hurt his family and in essence, hurt his relationship with God. In verses 24 to 26, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket, and they wrestled and dislocated his hip. Then he said to Jacob, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So again, up until this point, Jacob hasn't made great decisions, right? We see the consequences of those coming to light. And God has been trying to reveal himself, right? We see this in the beginning, right? When he starts to reveal himself to Abraham and he says, "I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make many nations through you." And he makes this covenant with Abraham, a promise for that he would be the one that, God would work through his family line to restore humanity, right? So he tells this to Abraham, then Abraham and Isaac, we see Isaac, right? He knows the promise, he's been given it, but he still doesn't make always the best decisions, but God sticks with him, and then now we have Jacob. And Jacob is alone, right? And often what I have found and experienced in my life, when God is trying to get my attention, sometimes that happens best when I'm alone, right? Like when I'm isolated, we call it silence and solitude, as a spiritual discipline, that sometimes, even we know that Jacob didn't choose silence and solitude, it just kind of happened for him. But we see that God will take advantage of any room that he sees in our life, right? To come in and reveal himself to us. Because the thing is, he's okay-ish where Jacob currently is, but he doesn't want him to stay there, right? He wants him to move towards righteousness and being, who God needs him to be in this redemptive story that God's working out. So silence and solitude is important. It gives God opportunities to speak. And through the pain, Jacob continues to fight, right? And I think this is another thing that we should think about a little bit, right? Like often when we have pain, we pull away, right? We want to run away from any kind of pain that we are experiencing. At least me, my anxiety response is flight. Some people are fight, but I think even in the fight, you're still responding, right? You're still acknowledging that something is going on that I'm not so happy about, and I'm going to see it through. And so for Jacob, even though there's pain, he continues to fight because in his mind, from his perspective, he knows he needs a blessing, right? So in ancient culture, you could either be blessed or you could be cursed. And there was like only so much blessing you could give out, and there was only so much curse you could experience. So there was always an exchange. Like if you were blessed, that means the curse was taken away, right? So Jacob is like, I'm cursed, right? From his perspective, he knows life is not going the way that it should or could, right? So he interacts with God and he says, I'm not going to stop fighting you until you give me a blessing. God's response, what is your name? In verse 27, the man asked. Jacob, he replied. So, did God not know Jacob's name? No. God knew Jacob's name, right? He knows everything. That's what we know is true about God. And this isn't God's first encounter with Jacob, right? And so in chapter 28, verses 13 to 15, this is a promise that God has given Jacob. The Lord was standing there beside him, saying, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your offspring the land on which you are lying. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out towards the west, the east, the north, and the south. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. Look, I am with you and will watch out over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Right? So the irony is Jacob has already been blessed by God. So did Jacob forget that? You know what? But I think he's still just trying to figure out who God is, right? I think God is constantly revealing things to us and talking to us, and then we ask him to reveal himself and talk to us, and he's like, well, I already did, but we need that again for whatever reason, right? Jacob needs God to reveal himself to him and give him this blessing. Because, I think he hasn't really been doing things out of his relationship with God. And I think in this moment, he's starting to have that realization. Like, yeah, when I try to make my own plans, when I try to scheme, my way through life, it's not going so well. I think I need God and his wisdom and his leading, right? And his circumstances had led him to lose trust in God, I think, a little bit, right? God gives him this blessing, but he's not seeing it. And we can pull back and say, well, you're not seeing it because of your decisions and different things like that. But from Jacob's perspective, God is not who he thought he was going to be for him, right? And so he's saying, I need trust in you again, Lord. I need this blessing. And the thing is, God will do whatever it takes for us to trust him. And that's the thing that I think I see a lot in Scripture is when I'm reading it, I'm talking to the people in the Bible. I'm like, don't you get it? Don't you get it? Right? But what about my life and my own experience, right? How truthful am I about my unbelief, right? Because I think of the man all the time in Scripture who says, I believe, but help me with my unbelief, right? And so as much as we look at Jacob and we kind of look down on some of his decisions, at least he's being honest before the Lord in this moment, right? He's saying, I need to trust you. And God's saying, okay, I'll do what it takes for you to trust me, but it may cause you some pain, right? So, we're thinking, yay, God will do whatever, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, right? God revealing himself to us is good. It's what we need, but maybe we don't like the truth. Maybe we don't trust him in the truth that he's revealing to us. It may cause us some pain when we see God. Psalm 30, verse 5, for his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor a lifetime. Weeping may stay overnight, but there is joy in the morning, right? So Jacob has sinned. We see this. We have already talked about it a lot. And we know that sin makes God angry, right? God is a God of justice, right? And he's creator. He set up his world the way that he wants it to function. And humanity doesn't do that so well, right? We fall short sometimes. And so we know that sin makes God angry, but he works out things so that we can gain his favor, right? That's what this psalm is saying. Because God tests us, but Scripture is clear. He never tempts us, right? That's not who he is. So he's not going to put us in a scenario and say, okay, Amanda, how are you going to respond to this, right? I put myself in bad scenarios, or I have the enemy who's trying to deceive and lure me into these bad scenarios, right? And so when we are there may be some weeping, right? We may be frustrated. Like, I don't know how many times I've said to God, like, how come this is still a temptation? Or how come you just haven't taken this away from me, right? But that's up to God, right? How he reveals himself, how he chooses to give us his favor, right? Because he says, well, you can be tempted in every way like Jesus was, but did not sin, right? And so I think we need these opportunities to see that we still need God's grace, right? We still need his mercy, because grace and mercy are not a one-time transaction when we say yes to relationship with Jesus, right? He wants that dependence, that devotion to last our whole lives, and even to go deeper and deeper as we age, right? And so I think we can, maybe the temptations are not as strong as they once were when we first said yes to Jesus, but the temptations are there to show us that his grace is sufficient for us in anything that we face, right? If he takes away temptation or hardship, then we don't need to rely on him. We don't need to come to him and say, I need you in my life, right? And then he takes these things and he works them out so we can gain his favor. And God's favor for us was displayed by Jesus on the cross, right? That's his greatest act of favor for humanity, was that Jesus took the punishment and we didn't have to anymore, right? If you look at the law of Moses and some of the consequences to sin, they were pretty severe. And depending on the type of sin, could lead to death. Could lead to your community taking you outside of the camp and stoning you to death. God does not like sin, right? And he would do anything to get it out of his camp, right? To get it out of his community. But he didn't want it to be like that forever. He didn't want it to be that people would die because of their sin, right? And so he put that punishment on Jesus. And we know the Easter story, right? We know, but I think it's so important for us to remember that, again, this wasn't a one-time thing, right? Jesus is interceding for us all the time. So when we are tempted, when things are going hard, when we're suffering, if we turn to him, then he's talking to the Father for us, and he's figuring out a way for us to come out on the other side with favor, right? Because weeping may happen in the night, but joy comes in the morning, that joy being God's favor. So we see that even though God has already blessed Jacob, he blesses him again, right? He gives him this blessing. Verses 28 to 29. Your name will no longer be Jacob, he said. It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with man and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he answered, why do you ask my name? And he blessed him there. So I think what this verse also shows us is that it's okay to wrestle with God. It's okay to struggle with him. It's okay to say to him, I believe, help me in my unbelief, right? I trust you to a certain extent, but I want more. I want more of you. I want more of your trust in my life. And often what I have seen is that people trust God until there is physical pain or disease, right? So they're living their lives, everything's okay, and then something happens, and that leads to a struggle with God. And I'm not saying that's wrong or bad, right? It just seems to be a typical pattern that once people like really are faced with death, then they start to struggle with God, right? So is God who he said he was? Can I trust that there is an eternity? Can I trust that I go to a better place on the other side of this, right? We start to struggle again. But for Jacob, his struggle led to the physical pain, right? He was wrestling with God, and God used this physical pain to increase his faith, right? So our struggle doesn't change God, right? And I think we worry about that. Or if we're honest, especially with the people who haven't said yes to Jesus yet, if we're honest with the ways that we doubt, we think we're hurting God's witness somehow, right? But what people need to see is that even though I'm in this circumstance, I still trust. And we need to remind ourselves, even though I struggle, I do still have faith, right? I do still have this hope in this future reality with Jesus. The thing is, God says, why do you ask my name? And in a way, God's saying, I've already introduced myself to you, right? Why are you asking my name? I've already made it clear to your grandfather Abraham and your father Isaac and you, Jacob, that I am God and I am going to bless you. So our struggle doesn't change God. Our struggle changes us, right? If we wrestle through the struggle, right? If we just kind of take our hands off of whatever we're going through and say, I'm not going to wrestle with God through this, that's losing, right? But if we take our struggles that we're going through and we wrestle with him through it, he's going to reveal himself and it's going to change us. It's going to lead us into a further dependence on who God is, right? And then he says, well, you're no longer Jacob because you wrestled with me and with man and you have prevailed. You have made it through. So now your name is Israel. So we've seen this happen before. We saw it with his great-grandfather, right? He was Abram, and then he became Abraham, right? And Sarai, and she became Sarah. And that's because in Hebrew culture, once your character changes, your name changes, right? And so we see as God revealed himself to Abraham and Sarah, they changed, and so they needed a new name. And the same thing has happened here with Jacob. This is Jacob's turning point, right? In his relationship with the Lord and with the trajectory of the rest of his life, right? And because of this character change, he needs to be identified as something new, right? And that's why we say we're born again, right? Maybe my name, I was born as Amanda, I'll die as Amanda, and I haven't felt led by the Lord to change my name. Who knows? One day maybe he'll think it's appropriate, but up until this point, I still have the same name, but I am not who I was, right, when I first said yes. Because I've had these wrestling moments with the Lord. And I've shared this with you before. One of my major ones was when I got pregnant with Evan, right? I thought, oh, I'm pregnant, I'm not married, I don't think I can follow Jesus anymore because Christians don't sin. And then I wrestled with God and his word, and he spoke to me and he said, no, I want you. I want to continue this relationship with you. And that was the best news I ever heard, right? I thought I heard the good news when I first said yes to Jesus, but that was, in that moment, the best news I'd ever heard. And for Jacob, he's walking away with a physical ailment, but I think what he's experienced is the best news he'd ever had up until this point, right? Because he knew that God would be with him. Verses 30 and 31, Jacob then named the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, he said, and yet my life has been spared. The sun shone on him as he passed by Peniel, limping because of his hip. So, what's interesting about this verse, right, we know that God has spoken to Moses already, and he has said to him, like, you can't see me face to face. No, he hasn't. This is future in Exodus. I just had like this moment. But we know from Exodus that God told Moses that if you see me face to face, you will die, right? And so for Jacob to say, I've seen God face to face, yet I have been spared, is like prophetic, right? Like this is an insight that God has given Jacob that he has not yet given to anybody through the law. And you see that, right? Like you see snippets of the law from Abraham to this point and moving forward, even before Moses gives the actual law, right? Because Abraham, we know that he didn't know the law, but he had faith, and God credited that to him as righteousness, right? He knew how to live rightly with God, even without a law. And so Jacob has had this great insight that he knows, even though he saw God face to face, he should not have lived. And what is even better about this is that Jacob doesn't just see him face to face, he actually wrestles with God. Like he has physically touched God, right? And has been spared. And if you look at the Hebrew behind the word spared here, it means protected. So again, this exchange has happened while Jacob has been wrestling with God, where he felt very vulnerable, right? He felt like his life could end at any moment, and now he is protected by God, right? That's the blessing, right, that God has given him, that he is now protective. Jacob deserves to die, right? Again, he didn't have the law yet, but in God's law and from his perspective, he deserves to die, but God spares him, right? He wrestles face to face with him, but doesn't kill him. He protects him. And that shows us that God will keep his covenant, right? So if I mess up and I sin, that doesn't mean God's not going to keep his promises, right? It doesn't change who God is. When I sin, it changes me, right? And it can change me for the worst. I can wallow and just feel a lot of guilt and shame, or I can keep my eyes fixed on Jesus and remember, no, Jesus has protected me, right? Now I wrestle with my sin, and I give it to the Lord, and I say, I can't do anything about this. And sometimes sin has consequences, right? In this fight, Jacob hurts his hip, it's dislocated. And we see he walks off with this limp, right? Like, we don't know if he was ever healed. I don't think he was, right? So even though he has this new blessing, this protection, it doesn't mean that there isn't consequences moving forward for him in his life. But because of the future hope, we can put up with the uncomfortableness for now, right? Like, if without the hope, then all we do is focus on the limp in our hip. Say that 10 times fast, right? But when we take our eyes off the limp and put it on Jesus and the blessing that he gives us to protect us, then we'll be okay. And spoiler alert, it might be in our reading next week, but Jacob does encounter Esau, and Esau quickly forgives Jacob, right? And not just does he forgive Jacob, he blesses him. He gives him gifts and stuff. So really, again, we are at the advantage that we know the full story. But if we could have just told Jacob that, a couple chapters ago, it really would have impacted him for the better. But again, he didn't interact with the Lord. He didn't wrestle with him. And the point that is clear here for us too is Jacob didn't go to God to wrestle. God came to Jacob and wrestled with him so that he knew the future of his life would be better, right? So the observation I made is like people often trust God until there's something major going on, right? So in this scenario, we're looking at physical health, but I think financial, anything that we feel like we don't have control over, when we start to feel the tension, right? I think that's when we start to struggle with God. Are you going to show up? Are you going to take care of me? Are you going to fill in the blank, right? But for Jacob, his struggle led to the physical pain. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, I don't know the verse, I'm sorry. It'll be up on the screen, though. For if I want to boast, I wouldn't be a fool, because I would be telling the truth. But I will spare you so that no one can credit me with something beyond what he sees in me or hears from me, especially because of the extraordinary revelations. Therefore, so that I would not exalt myself, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to torment me, so that I would not exalt myself. Considering this, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. And then Matthew 6:8, Jesus is saying to the disciples, don't be like them, because your Father knows the things you need before you ask him, right? So Paul needed the thorn in his flesh to be removed. That's what he was going to the Lord for. Please take this away. But he acknowledges, okay, God has done this for me because I need it, right? And Jacob needed to wrestle with God. They didn't ask for these things, but God knew they needed it, right? So in that Matthew verse, Jacob wasn't saying, hey, Lord, I need you to wrestle with me. But God knew he needed to wrestle with Jacob. Paul wanted the thorn in his flesh to go away, but God knew that he needed it, right? So for Paul, it was so that he would not boast and rely on God's strength. And then for Jacob, he needed to wrestle with him for the character change and then this new reliance on God moving forward, right? So is God with us even when we're physically struggling? Yes, right? But a lie is that we cannot be spiritually strong if we are physically compromised, right? So who's heard of the health and wealth gospel, the prosperity gospel, right? And it's this idea that if you have enough faith, if God is with you and you love him enough, you'll never struggle, right? So I know there are people that genuinely believe, like if I believe with no doubt that I can ask for a Ferrari, God will give me a Ferrari, right? Yeah, we're all laughing. None of us drive a Ferrari, and that's okay. That's okay. But that kind of thinking permeates the church, right? Whether we say we have prosperity gospel or not, we believe a little bit of the prosperity gospel, right? We believe, if God's with me and he loves me, then I won't struggle. Right? But what we see in Scripture is the exact opposite, right? We see Paul, who is one of God's most devoted followers. I mean, at one point he was killing Christians. Now he's planting churches and spreading the gospel for Jesus. I think I say his name every week, if not every other week, right? But we see he struggles. He struggled. And we know that he was martyred, right, for what he believed in jail, right? So we cannot, or we should not, question who God is when we struggle. If anything, our struggles should point us further into God, right? It should, instead of making us want to run away from God and try to fix things on our own, our struggles should lead us into God's presence. And then when we don't, he'll come in, right? He'll come in because he wants to prove that he is trustworthy, right? So the lie is that we cannot be spiritually strong if we are physically compromised. But the truth is Jacob was physically compromised the rest of his life, but his spirituality was stronger because he struggled, right? And so, like God told Paul, he says the same thing over us. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Would you join me in prayer? Well, Lord, I am the first to confess that I don't like struggling. I don't like, whether it's physical, financial, or anything else, as soon as I start to struggle, I'm trying to figure out how to get away from it. But thank you for your word. Thank you for this revelation that sometimes the struggle is there so that we can get closer to you. You know what we need, right? You're a good Father. Now, we still talk to you, and we can ask for healing, and we can ask for certain things to come into our lives that make the struggle less severe. But you know what we need before we ask. And like Jacob, there might be times where we need the struggle. You promise to give us what we need, and we love that when it's to our benefit, or at least when we feel like there's benefit right away. I don't think we love that you give us what we need when it hurts. And we know that any pain or anything that we experience right now is temporary. Your word tells us nobody loves discipline at the time, but it does lead to righteousness and right relationship with you. And so I know everyone in this room has struggled. I know some people are currently struggling, and I think, in our flesh, we just want it to end. We want to move on as quickly as possible. But if we take your word seriously and we take you seriously, we see that maybe the struggle is there for a reason. Maybe it's only for a season, maybe it's for the rest of our life. But for both of these men, you didn't take away the struggle. And so I guess, Lord, help us to be okay if you don't take away the struggle for us on this side of eternity. But through your Spirit, through the influence that you have in our lives, help us to see it as an opportunity to rely on you more, to be strengthened in you, and ultimately, at the end of the day, to trust you. And we need to know that you keep your promises. We need to know that you will keep your covenant with us. And for us, a part of the covenant promise is that you're going to return, and that one day there will be no more suffering. But for now, help us to see suffering for what it is, but trust that you are with us in it. And it doesn't mean that you have forsaken us. It doesn't mean that we're condemned. It just means that in this life we will have suffering, but take heart, you've overcome the world. And so until we see how you've overcome our suffering, just help us to endure. Help us to have patience. Help us to trust. Help us to love you well. Help us to love one another well. Because I'll also admit, when I'm stressed, I don't love great, because I'm so focused on myself. Help me to take my eyes off of myself and love others well, even when I'm stressed, even when the what ifs are in my mind and I don't know how you're going to work something out. Help me to look beyond myself, trust you for the results, and love you and myself and my neighbor well. I pray this all in your name, Jesus. Amen.